Take your Bibles this morning as we continue our look at revitalization and renewal, revival, whatever word you want to call, looking at Nehemiah in the 4th chapter. And I want you to turn there with me this morning. We'll read just a few verses and we'll point out some of the other ones. But as we think about being a Christian living in this world today or any time in this world, Christ made it very clear that in this world you have tribulation. In other words, trouble. He said, but fear not, for I have overcome this world. Now, you don't really know what he's talking about until you listen to his teachings and the words that he used. The word translated world into the English represents the anti-God system of people who do not believe in God. So when he says world, that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about the shape of the earth being, calling it the world. We, see it that way, but the actual word itself has specific reference to the anti-God system that exists in people who never believe in the one true God. This morning as I was watching a little bit of the news, just contemplating about the message, a guy from Israel came on the screen. And I believe he's the president. I can't remember his name. It wasn't Netanyahu. It was somebody else. And he made this statement. I thought it was pretty provocative for him to say this. He said, our nation represents the true God. And many of the nations that align with us believe in the same book and the same God. And I said, bingo. That's the reason why the world hates Israel, because it represents the one true God. Now, many of them don't believe in the one true God, though they represent him. But the fact remains, they came from that foundation. You see, there's only one true God, and his name is Jesus Christ. And when you see Israel under attack, just remember, they're being used by God. In the end times, they'll come back to God. But right now, they don't have the faith that Christians do. But one day, according to the Bible, they will. But nonetheless, because they exist, they're going to be under attack because hell is out to destroy anything that God is doing. There's a war going on. It's been going on since the beginning of time. So my message this morning, surviving against all odds, we're going to look at the life of Nehemiah as he was rebuilding the city through the people that put their, literally, hands together and decided they'd take a section of the wall and build it. And they rebuilt their houses and rebuilt the gates, because without that protection, the city was in danger and people who lived there could not live with security. And of course, the religious community went with that. The stronger and safer the nation and the city, then the better the worship experience. And so it was a joint effort to rebuild the city. And it's kind of like churches today that go through periods of history where they're not as strong, they're not as vibrant, low in attendance, low in participation. And many of our churches are finding themselves in that category as we moved into what we call, some people call, not me, the post-Christian era, when Christianity no longer really has a true voice in America. I don't believe that. But then when I look at what's happening in our country, I begin to see this anti-God group begin to rise up. And we saw it and witnessed with the passing and the killing of Charlie Kirk a little over a year ago. And I think it shocked many of us that someone would go to the extreme to take a person's life simply because they decided to take their faith into the public arena. I didn't know Charlie Kirk, but I started listening to some of what he had been saying. And I'm going to tell you this, he was very outspoken. And he literally confronted the evils that are around us, the absurdity of abortion and transgenderism and all these things on the college campuses. He made it very clear that they were directly opposed to what God's word said. And he boldly proclaimed faith in Jesus Christ. And he made it clear that there is a difference between God and between living without God, a very clear difference. And because of that, there were people that hated him. They still hate him even though he's dead, and they express that hate in a public way. Most of you will never see that kind of opposition. Because of the First Amendment of our Constitution, we're under protection unless the Constitution fails one day. We can go to the courts and we can sue the britches off of them if they really cross our areas of faith and practice. Did you know that? There's organizations that will join beside you. When I was in my last pastorate, we were very vocal in the community. We did a lot of outpouring of the truth into the community in which we live. We went to school board meetings and opposed some of the things going on sexual teaching of sexual behaviors and things like that. And we were constantly trying to find ways, and we got opposition. We had people who were critical to us. I've got emails. I had letters sent to me, and of course I put them in file 13. But the more you get out into the public arena, and that church that I pastored joined with me, and that was the nature of them to do so. We went to the abortion clinics. You're gonna sense that there's a lot of people in this world that hate God. And because they hate God and can't get to him, you're the first one to show up. In other words, you're in the front office. And so they express that hate. And I was constantly reminding those in that congregation that, that's showing that you're really taking the gospel into areas where it needs to be taken, and you're meeting and taking the light into the true darkness. In this world, you're going to have tribulation. You're going to have opposition. Let's read the verses this morning and point out at least four things in facing opposition and to the gospel and surviving. Verse number 1 of chapter 4. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall. Now remember, Sanballat and Tobiah, kind of a twosome. They didn't like what was going on, and here's some of the things they were doing. Sanballat became very angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day?" And by the way, over in another chapter, you know how long, let me ask you a question. How long did it take for them to build this wall back with all the gates? Anybody got an idea? You want to throw a number out there? 50. You ain't supposed to give the right answer to start with. We got Mr. Bible know-it-all over here, Andy, and I knew you was going to do that. I shouldn't have asked the question, should I? Good job, my friend. Let's give him a hand for coming up with the right answer. 52 what? 52 days, not years. Now think about this. The old Jerusalem's not as big as the new Jerusalem today that you see over there, but it's still pretty good size. And all the walls are down, all the gates are down. And guess what? 52 days these people got together. So don't tell me we as God's people can't make an impact in our country, in our community, and even in our families when we put our hearts and heads together. And this is what they did. And it says they made fun of them, and it said, "Can they bring the stones back to life from the heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, and this is some of the enemies of Israel. He's an Ammonite. He was in the city. Who was at his side said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing on top of it would break it down and their wall of stones." "Hear us, our God," Nehemiah says, "for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. Notice this, for the people worked with all their heart. They had a mind to work, as one translation says. May God bless the reading of his word this morning. Now, you can go on and read in the 4th and 5th chapter, and it gets pretty vicious. This Sanballat guy and Tobiah, and reading between the lines, the reason why is because they were able to make money off of the walls being down and the gates being torn down, and just imagining they could provide security, and they probably got paid for doing that. They could provide resources for the families to eat and survive, and they got paid comfortably for that. And so this was a money-making business for those who oppose God's work. And Satan used these people to create fear and anxiety among God's people and to discourage them. So when we look at these verses and we look at this chapter, the first thing, and I've already kind of alluded to it, is that opposition will come when you serve the Lord. When God is working, Satan is also working. And we see that in verses 1 through 3. Sanballat and Tobiah launched their attack with ridicule. What are these feeble Jews doing? Even a fox would break down their wall. When you commit yourself to serve God, you're going to have opposition. In John the 15th chapter, Jesus, talking to his disciples, made it very clear. He was speaking to them in the upper room. In just a few hours, Christ would be on a cross. They didn't see it coming. He warned them about it, but they still didn't see it coming. But in that conversation in John chapter 14 and in John chapter 15 and even 16 into 17, he's preparing his disciples for his absence. And one of the things he really hammered down in that 15th chapter is that the world hates Jesus. The world will hate you. He said, if I'm your master and you're the servant, because I'm your master, they're going to come after you. And I think sometimes as pastors, we don't do a very good job of preparing the Christians that we minister to that, hey, look, you're going to get opposition when you decide to live for God with righteousness and faithfulness and serve him. People are going to oppose you. He also said when we look at the teachings of Jesus that some of the worst opposition you'll have is within your own family. He said, you think I've come to bring peace, but not really. Because when people put their faith and trust in Jesus, and the family doesn't do that, you got division. And I've pastored long enough to see this, to see wives come to church by themselves because their husbands are not Christians and they don't want to have nothing to do with it. Then I've seen it turned around the other way, where husbands come to church and their wives don't come. And I've had people come to me and say, preacher, pray for my wife. I want her to become a Christian. And then I've heard the stories of those who later on got saved. And one of my friends in my last church who's now deceased, he tells a story that until he got saved up in his late 40s, that he was really a bitter and angry person. His dear wife said the same thing. She said he fought her all the time taking the kids to church. And he opposed her in every way he came. But when he came to know the Lord, of course, it was different. Some of you maybe have been in those situations where you've got family members that don't believe in the Lord. And sometimes it can get kind of hurtful, and sometimes bitterness arises because they are opposed to God and they try to oppose you. But I want to encourage you today that you keep praying for those family members. You keep praying for our country and for those who oppose us. And we're going to talk about how Nehemiah prayed. And it was kind of unique and unusual, but it's still a prayer. But just remember that the enemy's weapon is to discourage you, to stop you, and to keep you from moving forward for God. And then when it comes to revival in churches, when churches start catching on fire, you'll find that opposition can arise even within the congregation, that are opposed to the things that are ongoing and how God is moving in the church. And I've lived long enough and pastored long enough to see that. And you can see the opposition coming. But nonetheless, we need to be reminded that in this world as Christians, there are going to be those that oppose us when we serve him. Secondly, as that opposition comes, how do you deal with it? Well, Nehemiah gave us an example. He's a prayer warrior. And we discovered that prayer is our first response to those that would oppose us in our families and outside of our families in our country. When you go back and read the scriptures in verses 4 and 5, I want you to listen to this very quickly and listen to his prayer. Very short, and just think about what he's really saying here. He's praying to God. He said, hear us, our God, for we are despised. He recognizes what's going on. And then he gets pretty specific and he says, turn their insults back on their own heads. How many of you have ever prayed a prayer like that? How many of you have ever been in a situation and said, now, wait a minute, Jesus said, pray for your enemies and for those, who are against you, and we should. But he didn't give any specifics on how to pray. And you can bless them, that's true, but you can get real with God and say, God, they're in your hands now. The Bible says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. In other words, God says us, it's not for you to go after them and to make their life difficult because they're making your life difficult. Let God deal with that. But it's okay to ask him to deal with it, and that's what Nehemiah did. He said, just put it back on them like they're putting it back on us. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. And then he says, do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. In other words, God, we're your children. They've come after us because we're your children. And we're trying to do what you've called us to do. And now we're praying, God, don't go easy on them. Let them experience the full blunt of your justice. And that's what it is. A just God sees the evil done against his children. And God is a gracious God, but sooner or later he'll rise up and he will pay retribution back to those who oppose him and harm his children. So the benefits of praying, as we go back over it, guess what? Prayer is not the last resort. It's the first response. Don't wait till you get in a deep situation where things are very difficult. Start praying now. Before we used to go to the abortion clinic when we first got there down in Charleston. I did that for over 10 years. We would gather together in a circle and we would pray. Meanwhile, those who oppose us would come out, as I said, and say things at us, curse words, and you don't need to be here. Nobody wants to hear that. And, of course, they use very, very foul language. And and we were in a minority. We didn't lash back. We didn't call them names. We didn't tell them to shut up. On one occasion, we had one guy that spat on one of our people. And, of course, to me, that's not right. They never spat on me. I'm glad they didn't. Because there was an old me in here that got saved, but still there. And I wouldn't spit back. I'd probably I ain't going to tell you what I'd do. But nonetheless, by the grace of God, that never happened. But people did that. And we prayed and prayed for God's justice to come about. And it did on one occasion. Prayer keeps your spirit clean and your focus clear. When attacked, take it to God before you take it to the people. And I think that's all these are important. In other words, prayer protects your heart from bitterness and keeps you steady under pressure. So Nehemiah shows us an example. He's being called names. His people are being called names. And as we'll see later on in the chapter, they actually made threats to them. And, of course, he made plans to overcome those threats. So prayer is our first response. And then thirdly, stay focused on the work, not the opposition. Look with me again in verse number 6. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all of their heart. Church work involves not half-hearted work. In other words, as we get ready to get people on our nominating committees and things like that, don't go on those committees and say, well, I got nominated to do this, and never do anything. To me, you're just letting the wall remain down. If you're on a committee, you ought to get together, you ought to meet, because that is important. This church has organizational things that need to be done, and work needs to be done. You can't sit back and let time take over what's going on. Stay involved. Get involved. And if your committee is not meeting, and I told the nominating committee this morning that I was going to say some of these things, then you need to challenge those who are on your committee and say, look, why aren't we meeting? Why aren't we doing something? This church needs our leadership. This church needs work to be done. And that's what these people did, and the walls got rebuilt. And when it comes to serving God, as you do that, there'll be opposition, I assure you of that. But it's not the opposition that matters, it's the work that's so important, and you have to focus on that work. You see, unity of purpose defeats the enemy's strategy. They built the wall, the scripture says, for the people had a mind to work. A church with a shared mission is unstoppable. And I would add to that, a church that is committed to serving God at all levels of organization is a church that really insulates itself from Satan from within and from without. Now, I've lived long enough as a pastor, and I pastored 4 churches, and this is the 4th one. The other 3 churches, not too much different than this. And I've heard the stories of how things used to be in the church. When I was in some of those churches, some of the horror stories they told me about business meetings blowing up and people calling people names. And I'm thinking, that should not happen in the house of the Lord ever, 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 and forever. And they would tell these stories like it happened last week. And as I've shared with you many times before, when I've investigated further, it was years ago. But it was so bad. And things happen in churches that destroy families. Do you know that? Because churches are made from families. And when churches have difficulties or not focused on the work that God's called them to do, it's because they're too busy being busybodies and not busy about the business of the Lord. And so many times that happens. But churches that are healthy are churches that are vibrant. Everybody's picking up their load, doing their job. And before long, people are coming to know the Lord, and you see church growth. When I went to Ridge, we had 66 people that morning that voted for me to come and be their pastor. They said it was 100%. I never looked at the actual tabulation. But, I said, that's good. But everybody out there was probably, 50 years old or 60 years old. Half the church was in their 70s. And it looked like a group of people that we couldn't see much done. But let me tell you what happened. There were people praying before I got there. And I could sense that. And you know what? Things began to happen very quickly. And all of a sudden, we had people coming into the church, and they took over. By the time we got into the 5th year, we were over 200 in Sunday school from around 25 or 20. And then in just about 6 or 7 years, we were over 500 in worship. And if you're saying, and I never had a staff member. You say, well, how'd you do all that without your staff? I didn't have to. I had people that were Sunday school directors, people who were church training directors. Even the music was part-time people. Everything was part-time, but everybody was working like busy bees, and people were coming to know the Lord. And we were baptizing 50 and 60 a year for several years. You know when things began to change? When I started hiring staff members. Because then I had to worry about their circumstances, and some of them didn't do as good. So we had to start letting staff members go and things like that. And I got thinking one day, why can't we just go back to a time when everybody wanted to serve God and gave 100% to what they were called to do in that church, and just let's work together and see God work through us. That's the way it should be. And I've experienced that, and I know it's possible for every church, but you got to stay focused on the work. Why is Second Baptist here? Well, looking at your charter, I'll tell you why it's here. It's here because people believe in this community there needed to be a place where someone would preach the Bible without compromise, challenge people who are walking in darkness to give their hearts to Jesus Christ in faith, and for Christians to love each other greater than they could love anything else, and Christians to work like bees in a beehive, winning people to Jesus Christ. That is what I see from your charter. But let me ask you a question. Are we fulfilling that today? Are we rebuilding the walls? Hopefully we are. Finally, strong churches prepare and protect their mission. Look with me in verses 13 and 18. I think you'll like this. All right, so they've been threatened. They've been ridiculed. They've been made fun of. Who hasn't? So what? Well, in verse number 13, look what happens. It says that Nehemiah, back up in verse 11, also our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work. In other words, the word is out on the street. They're going to come in and start killing you while you're building this wall back. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. So now the fear is among the people. Nehemiah, I know you want to build a wall, but we've been told they've got an army and they're going to come in and kill us. And they're going to stop us. Translated into the 21st century, there are people out there that don't want to see Second Baptist Church grow in the Lord. They don't want to see people come to know the Lord. They oppose it. You hear their speech. They'll say things like, well, we're doing okay. We don't need it. Folks, we're not doing okay until God says it's okay. And you know what? Until he comes back, I don't think it'll be okay until he gets here and says, well done. So we got work to do. We can't be lazy. Or we're going to fall into the trap of letting the enemy take over. But they were basically saying they're going to kill us. So here's the response. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. This is a smart man. He said, I'm going to put people to guard, and I'm going to use families. And I'm going to give them the weapons they need. And he said, because they're families, you know what? People fight harder defending their families than they will anything else. Hopefully, that should be true. In fact, if you study history and you look at the diaries of soldiers fighting, they don't fight just for America. They fight for what's in America, and that's their families. And on several occasions in history, when there were charges made back in the days when they had the infantry and stuff, they would say things like, for your homes, for your families, for your daughters, for your sons, charge. And see, that's what Nehemiah figured out. Yeah, we got opposition, but we're not only just a church, as we say today, we're families. And your family is important to this church. Your participation is important to this church. And when you give 100% of what you've been set aside to do, then guess what? It makes the church stronger. This family, working side by side with this family, overcomes the opposition. Let's keep reading. He said, after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. And when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. Now notice this. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with what? Spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. He had a strategy here. The families were stationed together. The builders were carrying tools and weapons. Organization. If you don't take any word out of here today, we've got to be organized. But if we're organized, we got to be working within that organization. And we can't sit back and just let it float by like it doesn't mean anything. You know, when I was going with y'all through revitalization, and I saw the things you were voting on, I'd already went through that with Ridge. And they made some major changes. It doesn't look like the same church when I was there. But they baptized in the last couple of years far more people than I did, except for my earlier years when I was there. They needed revitalized. They needed revival. And they made some radical changes. And probably changes I would have been afraid to do, but it's paying dividends. Are they in a perfect church? No. Have they got some areas of weakness? Yes. But overall, the gospel's being proclaimed and people coming to know the Lord, but they went through that and they were serious about it, and the changes came. We did this here. But I'm telling you, at this point in our walk together, we've kind of gotten slack. The walls are coming down. And I'm putting a challenge to you in these series of messages to let's get back to work and build these walls back. Let's get organized. Let's when we get on these committees, let's work. Let's quit playing games and playing church. Let's be serious about it. And if your committee is not meeting, call up the other committee members and I'm having a meeting at my house. How about you show up since we're on this committee? Don't sit back and wait for somebody to do something. Just do it, like Nike says. Just do it. And that's what we've got to do if we're going to have a strong church. They were carrying their tools and their weapons. They were prepared. They were organized. But notice this. He also had a trumpeter ready to sound the alarm key. You know what that translates to in a church today? He had an alarm system so that if this part of the wall was being attacked, the trumpet would blow, and then the army, rest of the people would put down their working tools, grab their weapons, and run to where the conflict was. And so he was basically saying, this is my communication, this trumpet. And part of churches being strong and growing in the Lord is communicate. Be aware of what's going on all the time in all the organizations. We need to keep our secretary informed of what we're doing so she can get out the information. We need to plan ahead of time and make announcements ahead of time. And when we announce these things, make sure they're carried out. And the trumpet was a way of communicating the crisis that was arising. So God's people must build and battle at the same time. Many of you are going through struggles. When I was going through cancer, and I know, Richie Lou, you know what I went through, and we lose our hair, and people look at us, and some feel sorry for us, and then, some people said, oh, it's a pitiful thing, and they don't know we're doing fine. And then someone told me, the lady told me I looked like her dead husband, and that made me feel real good. But I said, well, I'm glad he was a handsome man. But nonetheless, he was bald as an eagle. But listen to this. Some of you are struggling with health issues. I struggled with health issues. And Gail will tell you there was only 4 Sundays I missed in the time that I did chemo. And I would come up the stairs, and I'm not trying to brag on anything. I would come up those stairs preaching, thinking, that's the last time I have a chance to speak for the Almighty God. And I said, Lord, give me the strength to do it. And I preached. After I went through that, I buried 6 or 7 people that had cancer. While I'm going through chemo, I'm burying some of my members who died from cancer. And that's an interesting thing when you're doing somebody's service and you don't have any hair and you're laying them to rest and you're facing the same enemy they're facing. Are you listening to me? You say, well, why would you put yourself through that? I believed that God was using a difficult time to bring a message to the church of hope, of restoration, and endurance by the grace of God. And so by doing all of that, it helped me to stay focused on what God was doing in my life and not on the sickness. I want to say something to you this morning that you're going through trials, but there's still work to be done. And Satan loves to distract us. He loves to put other things in our way. Oh, go do this or plan for this and do all of that. And then things that need to be done in the house of God go undone because we're distracted. These people weren't distracted. They knew the enemy didn't want it built, but guess what they did? They kept focusing on what God did. Spiritual warfare is real. Preparation is part of being faithful to God. That's why we have Sunday school. That's why we have Wednesday nights, Sunday nights, and Sunday morning. Preparation. Me preaching the word to prepare you to do the work of God. In fact, the Bible says my role is to equip you. That's it. It's not to do the work, but it's to equip you to do the work, to challenge you, to make you feel uncomfortable if necessary, to let you see there's work to be done as we fight against the darkness of this world. And if the churches will wake up, our nation will change overnight. But so many of our churches are distracted and they aren't being challenged to be faithful to the things that God has called us to be faithful to. Finally, stay alert, stay armed, stay unified. This is how God's people survive against all odds.